Now this is the difficult one. There are many parents, when it comes to issues of sexuality, tend to cringe a little bit. Sometimes it's because a parent doesn't want to think about this little baby, this little innocent son or daughter is now someone who is capable of sexual relationships. They don't even want to think about it, don't even want to talk about it, tend to flee from it. And also because it sometimes can be awkward to have these conversations with our children. We don't know how to navigate that. And then we're living in a culture where some of these questions are just far more difficult than we ever had to face before. We haven't had a model to help us through navigating what it means to raise children in a sexually confused culture. But actually we do. The gospel didn't first emerge in some idyllic little small town. The gospel emerged in a sexually decadent Roman Empire. All of the questions that we're facing right now, the church has faced before. And so we ought to be the people who are confident enough in our gospel, confident enough in the Word of God to be honest, open, and truthful with our children about sexuality.
Well, welcome to session 4. My name is Andrew Walker, and around the table I'm joined by Ben Stewart, Russell Moore, and Jackie Hill-Perry. And in this session, we're going to be discussing one of the most challenging aspects facing parents today, and that's the issue of sexuality. And to begin the conversation, Dr. Moore, I want to begin with you. And how do we teach and model a biblical perspective on sexuality in this culture to our kids?
Well, I think sometimes what parents are most afraid of are the culturally sensitive sexuality questions. They're in the news all the time, so dealing with homosexuality, same-sex marriage, and those various issues. When in reality, talking about sexuality with children has always been tough. And I mean, one of the most difficult things is just to prepare children for puberty. And to prepare children for sexuality at all. Now, that becomes more complex when you have all kinds of questions that they're asking. But I think the most important thing is to beat the culture to the punch. You be the one who explains God's design for sexuality to your children before they encounter that in the outside world, which means you need to be savvy as to what's going on with them. So if you have, you don't necessarily want to do in an age-inappropriate way, but you want to say, I want to be one step ahead of the sorts of questions that they're going to be asking so that they can know, I can trust my parents. And the other part of it is, don't run away from any question. If your child is asking you a question, then that means your child is old enough for you to talk to that child about it. And you don't want to signal, oh, I'm freaked out, I'm scared by you asking me that question. Now, you may give just a small answer that's enough for the child at the time, but answer the questions and answer them honestly.
I think that's a great point. I just think championing the positive, you know, and for me with little kids, it's seeing my wife and I be affectionate, hug each other, give her a kiss, that sort of thing. And then also try not to shame our kids when they ask questions. Ours are little, so they're asking about their bodies. But then for us, it's also letting them know who gets to be around you when you are in the bathroom, or who gets to be a part of you changing clothes, things like that, like those open dialogue kind of things. But for me, in interacting with all the way up into college students, I found one of the most compelling things to do with college students was to champion the positive. When we talked through Song of Solomon, said, here's what marriage can be. The yearning in the human soul for a sexuality that encompasses the physical and emotional, and that safety and vulnerability is so compelling and attractive. A million arguments were won with kids because they're like, I want that. How do I get that?
Yeah, that's completely accurate because I was working with some teens in Chicago, and they loved the idealism of one man and one woman being married. They just thought it wasn't attainable because that's not what they had seen.
Yeah.
And so I think even being someone, even if you're around fatherless children or around adopted children or around just diverse relationships. I think them seeing an exalted view of marriage as God intended really does do something to how they live their own lives.
Absolutely.
I heard a guy one time, we were doing a youth retreat on sexuality issues, and this guy stood up and said, "You all think that sex is so great now. Just wait till you've been married to the same woman for 20 years, and same thing day in and day out." And I'm sitting there thinking, first of all, your marriage is in crisis. Second of all, I know what's going on in the minds of all of these 8th grade boys, which is, well, if that's my future, then I better get while the getting's good, and that's just most people don't present that picture explicitly.
Yeah.
But you can present it implicitly if all you ever talk about is don't do this and don't do that.
Totally. Yeah.
Ben, I want to follow up on this question and address it to you. When we talk about modeling and teaching this in our families, how do we take in consideration the different ages of our children? So when a child emerges from being a small child to a teen to an adolescent to an adult, how do we as parents kind of model biblical sexuality, taking into consideration their age?
Yeah, well, I think for us, what we're trying to do in our home is create like a base level, no shame culture with our kids, in the sense of like every question's okay to ask, and we're not going to slap down your questions or issues. We're going to try to engage you where you are developmentally and talk through what you're thinking or what you're feeling, what you're experiencing. So with my kids at 5 and under, it's more about their own bodies, and even saying, well, like I mentioned earlier, who's okay to be with you in these areas? Or no, Dad's going to go to the bathroom by himself. This is kind of a private moment, and sort of kind of talking through some of these things. And I think what Dr. Moore said was right on. You're gauging what kind of questions are they asking, and if you've created a base in your home where conversation's normal, and so for us, that's where we're trying to get ahead of the sexuality question by having a home where we talk about everything. And so we have breakfast together and dinner together, and then I get them in the car, because in the car, my kids are more apt to talk. I mean, they're back in their high chair, and we're discussing all kinds of stuff, and or their car seat. And we just want a culture where they're ready to talk about anything. And hopefully that's what I'm setting us up to.
Yeah, and I think part of it is too, you need to know the dynamics in your house. With our kids, our oldest kids, they were older when I talked to them about these things than, say, the ones who came later, because if you're in a house with 5 kids, there are going to be conversations. I want to beat the older kids talking about it there. But they were completely surprised. One of my kids said to me when we had this conversation the first time, first of all, this is repulsive. Second of all, I need to know the answer to this question. Have you ever done this to my mother? And I took that as a good sign, because I said, okay, that means I have beaten the culture to the punch on this one, and I didn't know if I had or not. And so that's good. You're able to say, no, this is how God designed this, and this is why it's great.
Well, and to me, I look at like Proverbs, you go, this dad is reasoning with his son about this is going to come at you.
That's right.
And he doesn't just say, hey, there's going to be moments where you're going to feel a little funny or tempted. He's like, you're going to be walking down a street and she's going to say this, look like this, promise that, it's going to feel like that. I mean, he's given his son a detailed scenario, working off the assumption that temptation's going to come at you and I won't be there to protect you. Right. And here's the logic I want you to have in that moment. And here's the dangers that will present to you. And you go, these are kids right in the puberty range. At that day, you go, okay, in that day, you're talking to a 13, 14, 15-year-old kid with this level of honesty and transparency. I think that's a good model for us.
That's right. Jackie, the next question I want to kick off to you is, we live in a culture where sexual purity is not valued. In fact, it's treated with hostility in the broader culture. So how do we as parents counter this view that says sexual purity doesn't matter? And how do we champion that in our families?
I think sexual purity isn't valued because God isn't valued. And so I think there has to be heavy emphasis on the fact that we were created for God. And in Him also creating sexuality is to be expressed in marriage, and that honors God. And so I think if I were raising my daughter in such a way, which I hope I will, but in such a way, I want her to see that, no, this is what makes God happy, and this is how you actually live out your humanity in a way that is healthy, that is solid, that is good for you, your soul, and also for the world to see. And so I think that I just have to talk about God more than I just talk about sexuality. It can't just be sexuality isolated from God. And so I think that's one of the ways, and I think parents should and leaders should even enter into discussing this topic. It has to first start with the Lord. You know. So.
Yeah. Well, and I think science helps us nowadays with, there's just been this propensity to divorce sexual experimentation and indulgence from your emotional life. And for me, working on college students, you go, that's really championed in a million ways in the culture. When you go to college, experiment sexually, but don't get tied down emotionally. But you're looking at that and going, okay, but we know that sex doesn't just fire dopamine, to give you that hit to reinforce the behavior. It releases hormones, oxytocin, same things that's released in breastfeeding. That's built for bonding, built for emotional bonding. So you have anthropologists like Helen Fisher saying there is no such thing as casual sex. And she's not saying that from a faith commitment. Right. She's saying sex was designed physically for an emotional connection. Yeah. And so what science is discovering is what Paul said. When you bind your bodies, you become one flesh. You do violence to yourself when you try to rip apart the physical component of your life and the emotional component. And listen to pop culture, listen to the songs. They all talk about, I'm going to have an unrestrained sexuality, and then they talk about the deep pain of betrayal. And you can show that to your kids and go, this doesn't work. And then on the flip side of that, what I love about Proverbs 5 is he's warning his son, this is not a good thing. And then he flips the page and says, so enjoy that wife of your youth. Right. May her breast satisfy you forever, which is not about procreation. That's about pure fun. But do it with somebody that you're safe with. And what I found with college students is they want that emotional connection. Yeah. They want to be known, loved, and safe. Yeah. And so again, that's where championing that positive for them helps them see, the culture champions something they also hate and loathe.
That's exactly right. And that comes back to, I think, Jackie's point from earlier. I've found this with older teens. They know this isn't working, but they don't have the imagination to see there's an alternative for me. Right. I could actually be walking in a different way. So when you talk abstractly about sexual purity, I think we assume that teenagers especially even know what we're talking about. Instead of thinking, well, this is some sort of abstract ideal, like don't sin, that won't work for me. And we've got to be more specific than that.
Yeah.
Ben, next question's for you. Obviously, one of the greatest challenges in culture today is the issue of pornography. So how do we prepare our kids for this reality that's just so prominent throughout the culture? And then how do we minister to our kids if they fail in this area?
Yeah, I would say three things. As a parent, and especially when they're growing up in your home, there is that protection element of, as a parent, I'm creating a culture where my kids can flourish. And if I let the World Wide Web into my child's life, into their bedrooms at all hours, I'm not protecting my child. So I do think as a parent, especially when they're younger, you set those hard boundaries. We won't have screens in private places in our house. And I'll have to model that, saying, you're not going to be in bed with your phone, like that vulnerable moment to let the whole world in. We're not going to do that. We're going to set parameters on what we watch as at home, and screens are in public places where everyone can see, and I am going to put controls on our screens. So there's that protective element. But then again, I look at Proverbs and you go, the dad's realizing, once you're getting, especially up into your teens, I won't be there. So the parent that's just trying to do that on into their kids' junior high and high school years, you go, there's the protective element and then there's the reason. You have to start to reason with your child of going, if you walk down that path, here's where it goes. And Proverbs, he tells them, it's gonna look great, but you will be bound with those cords. And I think you can talk to them very honestly about addiction. And for me, I see it all the time. Young men not much further down the road from them that are bound fast in the cords of addiction, and they wish someone would have reasoned with them. If you go down this trail here, here's where it goes. So I think there's a reasoning element. And then the last piece I would say is the grace element with your kid of being compassionate when they struggle. I tell guys that all the time now. They're like, I can't believe these kids today struggle with pornography. I'm like, remember yourself in junior high. Give that kid the World Wide Web.
Yeah.
And they're like, oh. And I'm like, exactly. So have compassion on those who struggle. And my hope is with our kids, when they come to us and say they have seen these things and it fills their heart with shame, which it always does, that we will create a culture where they will want to come with us, to talk to us, and they know we are a house that stresses forgiveness and grace and love, and then starts to speak the truth into it. So that would be my quick advice.
Sure. Dr. Moore?
Well, I think it also comes back to, again, that vision of positive sexuality. What the devil does with pornography is to give you a promise of heightened sexuality that ultimately strips away the ability to even have sexuality.
That's true.
And so, I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've encountered young couples, married couples in their 20s who aren't having sex. Not in their 60s and 70s, they're in their 20s, newly married. And it's difficult for them to have sex. And you look around and find out why. It's almost always the husband, and it's almost always a long-running porn situation. And what he says is, I just find it awkward. It's really awkward. Well, what he means by that, actually, if you look at it, is it's intimate. And it's intimate in a way that just feels hurtful. It just can't get around that. Well, that's exactly right. The world, the flesh, and the devil stripping away the sort of mystery and joyful union with one another that sex is. And so when you're talking about porn and what the world is doing, you need to come around and say, what this is trying to do is to rob you of a joyful marital sexuality that points you to heaven, to the union of Christ and His church.
Amen.
Well, so the next question is, I'll start with Jackie, is this issue of same-sex attraction that we need to be having with our teens and with our children. Why is it important to begin introducing this topic with children? Yeah. And how do we appropriately address this subject with children?
I think it's important to introduce it because the world will introduce it. Whether you're at the bus stop, whether it's a commercial, even YouTube, there's an influx of same-sex relationships, I think, being projected in media and just in our culture, period, where children will see it and say, okay, is this a thing? Like, does this mean this is okay? So if, like, I have friends who their son is very, very young, like first grade, who has found out about boys kissing boys through YouTube. And so I think these conversations have to start early, but I think if you already get ahead of the curve by just, hey, this is mommy, this is daddy, this is what God says about it, this is beautiful. I think establishing the beauty of heterosexual relationships as God-ordained relationships and God's design, I think it will show how it's not a normal thing to see it, because I think the normalization of it is what's the most destructive thing. But I think if they see it as strange and not okay and not truly beautiful, then I think you set your child up, I think, to be able to engage with it more discerning, I guess. So, yeah.
I've found that a lot of the reluctance from parents on talking about same-sex attraction is, as one father said to me, I don't want to introduce that because I'm afraid it will give my child ideas. And so, okay, we have all sorts of culture war divisions in America over gay and lesbian issues. One thing I think we can all agree on is you're having a conversation with your child is not going to direct your child's sexual orientation one way or the other for the rest of his or her life. And so having that conversation to be able to say, this is how God designed sexuality. Other people disagree with us. And here's what they think, here's what they believe, here's why we don't believe that that's the case. But at the same time, making sure that you're valuing people who have same-sex attraction and people who are gay and lesbian and transgender and all of the people that they will encounter in the world, as Jesus does when he encounters people who are hurting, people who are broken, people who are outside of God's will. Our kids need to know that. And I think sometimes parents think just because we're in a world where these issues has become normalized, that means that we don't have issues of, say, bullying going on. We do. And so we need to have the kids who are able to stand up and be unpopular by saying God's design for sexuality, one man and one woman, is right, and every other way is wrong. And the kids who are going to be willing to be unpopular by standing up and saying, you're not going to bully that gay or lesbian kid because that person's created in the image of God. And that means watching and seeing where the vulnerability is.
Yeah.
Ben?
Well, and that's where, for me, I think of it, and, I remember when I was younger being in rooms and where, people would preach the Bible and say, so if you struggle with, and they would name different issues like pornography or whatever, go, I just don't even understand why would, and the way they would talk about it, the feel was, if you're wrestling with that, and so it created an avenue where go, man, if I am struggling with that, this is not a safe place to discuss it. These are not safe people to talk about it with. And so for me in ministry, I think increasingly we're going to have to create moments where if young people are struggling with all kinds of, because now what you can be into sexually is so varied, and what you can be introduced to early on is so varied. When I talk to young men, there's just so much confusion, and if I come charging in with a sermon too fast, it shuts down the processing of what's going on with them, which is usually some hurt underneath it and some deeper issues we've got to get to. So I think a culture where there's a lot of grace for those who struggle as we preach the truth is going to be essential. I think the temptation is to say, well, this is the truth, and get on board, and you go, you're not leaving space to help that person process and come along. That Jesus did so well. When someone was in a broken place sexually, he didn't come crashing down with the law. He met them where they were and began to move them, and I think we need to get better at that.
And for parents who have a same-sex attracted child, one of the things I think that you need to know is to teach what the nature of temptation is. Because I find that a lot of, especially teenagers who are grappling with this issue personally, they think, well, if I'm following Jesus, then that means that this pull that I'm feeling is going. In reality, none of us are free from temptation. We have different points of vulnerability, but if you find yourself not being tempted, that means you're probably yielding to temptation and you just don't know it. And so to teach, hey, your life is going to be, no matter what, a life of spiritual warfare. You're going to be fighting against temptation all the time. And so your temptation may be this, okay? Well, we're going to fight together and fight with the power of the Spirit against that. And one of the problems, I think, for parents is that we have a lot of churches that unintentionally, perhaps, give the signal, if your child has sexuality issues, then that means that you've done something wrong as a parent. And so there's a shaming of the parents, when in reality, that's just not what the Bible teaches us about the way that we have. Every family in the Bible has children who are having difficulties and straying in various ways. So we need to remove that.
Ben, you mentioned this in your remarks. What counsel would you give to a parent whose kid comes to them and says, I'm sexually active, or I'm even pregnant, or the parent finds out that the child is sexually active and the kid doesn't know that the parent knows? What counsel would you give?
Well, the scenarios that could be happening in that moment are pretty wide, so it's hard to, the first thing I would want to do is really hear the story of how did we get here, what's going on, because as I've counseled teenagers, things like that, sometimes they felt very pressured and didn't want to do it, and there's almost a relief when a parent says you don't have to do that. For others, there's a rebellion that came from maybe an emotional hurt that you've got to address. So that's where I would say the first thing is doing your best to create a conversation where the kid can talk about what's going on in me. It's diagnosing before prescribing, and hopefully the parent can do that. They may need to bring in other voices that the kid trusts that could be authority figures in their life to help with that conversation. But that's where I would start, is going, what's going on with you? And so before I freak out or the sermon starts, let me hear what's happening with you. And often I found, if by the time a young person gets pregnant, they've realized this was not the best path. What I've found to be wonderful with like a young pregnant girl is when the parents and their Christian community cannot recoil but move toward that child and say, we are in this with you. We are your community with you, and we will love both you and that child on into forever. And when I was growing up, my church was very small. I'll never forget the pastor standing up with us with one of the elders' daughters was pregnant. And we had a little bitty church, so it fit to do that on a Sunday. He stood up in front of all of us and said, here's the situation, talked with the girl openly about it because she had already been through counseling. And then he looked at the church and said, and we are going to love her, and we are going to love this child, and this is a child of our house. And that was the most loved little kid, and so redemption always comes out of brokenness in the story of Jesus. And I think we have to let that happen with our pregnant teenagers.
And what I think parents and churches fear, if they stand up and say preemptively, if you ever get pregnant, if you ever find yourself in a situation of sexual immorality or whatever the scenario is, you can come to us and here's what the response will be. They're afraid that then gives a signal, it's okay for you to do this. That's not what that does. No. Instead, it's actually helping to build a foundation where that child or that teenager, that young adult knows, I've got a community here that's around me that I have not only support from, but responsibilities too.
Yeah.
And so because if you don't, then you're going to have the abortionist in the background who's going to be the one who's able to be the person that wants to be talked to with a profit motive behind it. And so we have to deconstruct that ahead of time.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think if girls in particular, I think if a young lady comes and says, hey, Mom, I've been sexually active, I think the why is huge. Because the act is just indicative of something else. And so most times it's comfort, it's self-esteem, it's identity, it's a lot of other things that I think you as a parent can help them wrestle through, because it won't just stop after they graduate high school, after they graduate middle school. That will continue into adult life. And so let's work through these identity issues now. Let's work through your need for comfort now. Let's believe that God really is the source of all comfort and how that should inform how you behave in your male-female relationships. But also I think if pregnancy happens, the affirmation that this baby is a gift of God. So many abortions happen because of fear of how the parents will respond.
Right.
And so how can we affirm that, no, that might have been sin, but this is a blessing, and you don't have to be afraid that we will not walk alongside you and love this child like we love you.
Yeah.
And sometimes the hidden message that parents unintentionally send is don't be sexually active because it will ruin your successful career path that we have laid out for you. Instead of, this is how God defines sexuality. And I think that also means defining what sexual immorality is, which means some difficult conversations that some parents don't want to have. But you look at study after study after study, you have high school kids and college kids who don't believe that oral sex is sex. Or other forms of sexual activity, and parents are like, oh, I don't want to talk about those sorts of things. Well, if you're going to talk to them about what it means to be a faithful follower of Jesus Christ, and Jesus says, flee sexual immorality, you have to define what sexual immorality is when the world is having contrary definitions.
Yeah, and I would add to that, what I've seen in a lot of parents is when they do find out their kid's been sexually active, they're grieving, oftentimes it's like the death of the dream. They had an ideal dream for their kid and that dream is dying. And they're grieving that dream. And you go, I get that. That was a real loss. You had hopes, but grieve it and bury it and then believe that here in the real world with your real child who really struggled with that, the same God is mighty and sovereign over them and loves them and is in the business of bringing beauty from ashes. And so the loss of that dream is not the loss of a redemptive, beautiful story in your family. It just might be the beginning of one that could be a blessing to generations.
Yeah, when you signed up to parent, you didn't sign up for a dream, you signed up for a person.
Yeah.
With everything that entails.
Well, thank you all for this conversation. It was really encouraging. We want to encourage you as you begin to engage on these conversations in your small group regarding these topics, to be willing to go be vulnerable and discuss these issues about the challenges you face as parents in a culture that has many conflicting and divergent views with the biblical witness on sexuality. So thank you very much.
There's some parents who avoid the talk with their children. They don't want to have it, and by the time they have that conversation about sexuality, the child is way past the parents in terms of understanding there. But then there are other parents who I think assume that once they've had the talk, that these issues of sexuality are now covered. It doesn't matter how comprehensive you were or are in talking to your children about sexuality. The answer is not a talk. The answer is a series of talks that teaches our children what it means to have a sexuality that's grounded in creation, that points beyond nature itself to the union of Christ and His church. So that our sexuality is to point us toward that one flesh union that is itself a picture of the gospel, an invitation hymn of the good news of a Christ who never leaves His people and who cleaves to His people. That means that we have to be the people who are willing to have honest conversations, people who are willing to tell our kids the truth, people who are willing to extend to our kids grace, and people who understand that sexuality isn't really ultimately about sex. Sexuality is ultimately about Christ.